Howdy, everybody.
Howdy.
Today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Brian Jackson of North Carolina. Dr. Jackson is a professor of horticulture and the director of the Horticultural Substrates Laboratory at North Carolina State University. Dr. Jackson has studied and researched soilless substrates for horticultural crop production systems since 2003, with an emphasis on designing and characterizing engineered wood and bark materials. In addition to being a global expert in soilless production systems, Dr. Jackson is also heavily involved in national and global substrate initiatives, consultations, and multi-disciplinary scientific collaborations. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Jackson to present.
All right. Thank you, Mason. Howdy. That may be, I wanted at least to get one good positive reaction from your faces in the next hour. I figured that was it. What a pleasure to be here. To be invited to speak to any department, I don't take lightly, and it's an honor as a faculty, but to be, and I say this to anyone, to be invited by one of the premier horticulture departments in the country, that is still a horticulture department, is even better. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that. So in thinking about this, and I've spent a good amount of time thinking about the opportunity today, and I've taken some latitude, and I'm going to cover a lot of different areas and a lot of different grounds to hopefully provide perspective, okay? Because today is not going to be about learning soil physics, which I know is why you're here, okay? Or to learn details about little nuances within the soilless culture world and producing crops in soilless culture. But I want to share with you, through my eyes, what I'm seeing globally with some of the current initiatives that are happening, both at the environmental level, as well as at the academic level, and then the global industry level, about how soilless culture can fit in to solving some of the world challenges that we have to do that. All right, so if I can get this. Oh, yep. I thought that was only a North Carolina thing. Yep, there we go. Okay, so a little bit about myself. I always find that to be a nice place to start is who is speaking to you and what my path has been to get here. So a little bit about myself. A background in soilless substrates. Now, soilless substrates, of course, being a key element within the soilless culture and soilless systems world, and it's where I've spent the last almost 21 years of my life. So I'm going to go through that. And the other thing, I broke it down into different climates, okay? And I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts and opinions and facts and data on changes within the climate relative to the environment, and then changes in the climate relative to technology. Now, climate in this sense means the climate that we're in society, and how technology is changing and benefiting, and some obstacles as well relative to soilless culture. And then a bit about demographics and how people are changing and how science is changing to meet people's needs, demands, and requests. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the changes in the climate of academics. And I'll share with you why I've chosen to spend a little bit of time there. And then I'm going to turn it kind of to all of us and say, hey, there's grand challenges that we, as much as any other branch of science, have the ability, capability, and responsibility of doing. And that's feeding the world, all right, and trying to improve that system, all right? Oh, there we go, in that direction. So the Horticultural Substrates Lab, which I am now the director of, a former colleague and I kind of came up with our motto for the lab. And it's one that I live by and I breathe by, and I think it's really adamantly true, all right? And I think this is true for all areas of research, regardless of whether it's engineering, whether it's science, whether it's medicine. Why do we do research? To solve problems or create opportunities. And solving problems often is more immediate, something right now that needs addressing or fixing. Creating opportunities is a bit more of a risk, and there's often less funding available to do risky things with no safety net, as opposed to just getting funding to solve an immediate problem. And I think substrates within the soilless culture world offer both of those, from a grower diagnostic of solving a problem at their greenhouse or nursery, creating new opportunities, meaning making new products for that. So that's kind of the motto that we kind of function by. Now, one quick thing, and I mentioned no soil physics, but I do want to separate a bit about what soil scientists do compared to what soilless, notice not soulless, all right, soilless scientists do. So what do soil scientists study? Water, air, solids, and plant growth. Well, look, but that's Brian, that's no different than substrate scientists. Here's the difference. A soil scientist, I equate to being a doctor. When you go to a doctor, he or she, they can only fix your existing system and try to fix it as best as they can. And that's what soil scientists do. Based on the soil type, we've had conversations today about biochar being one thing to improve certain soils, but we can't make them, can we? That takes millions of years, all right? Compare that to a substrate scientist. I'm not a doctor, I'm more of an engineer, because what we do is we create functional systems. And that's the first thing I would say, and likely I'm preaching to the choir because you know this, is that the growing media we use today are highly structured, highly crafted, engineered materials to function the way that we want or need them to. So at soil, a doctor, soilless kind of an engineer. So my lab that I'm been at for now 15 years, I've been in NC State for 15 years, full professor at this point, so focusing solely on soilless substrate innovations, diagnostics, working with growers, of course, training graduate students, which I've had a lot of conversations with several of the graduate students here. But this lab, a bit about the background, and you're going to hear a bit about history today and why I think that matters for us all right? This lab was actually created in the early 1980s by several faculty at NC State University who came together with their expertise, one in nutrition, one in nursery crops, one in floriculture, and one in soils, and said we need to create a consortium together to solve production-related problems, all right? And this was an article written about the lab and the two founders, Ted Bilderback and Bill Fontenot, who, after all these years, are still very good friends of mine and mentors of mine, and they're now retired, living their life, and I'm left with all the grad students that they've stuck me with, all right? So, what do we do in the soilless substrate world? Well, you got four basic properties and parameters for any soil or substrate, all right? Physical, hydrological, that's where we spend the majority of our time, measuring, studying, working with, engineering, designing, soils to have various physical and hydrologic properties. We spend a little bit of time in the chemical side of things, all right, and that's pH, EC, or toxicities. A lot of organic materials have phytotoxic components that we need to eliminate or reduce before we can use them in growing media. And the last one I don't really touch on at all, but it's probably one of the most critical, and it's certainly one of the most untapped areas of all of soilless and soil science, and that's the biology. How do we capture or understand more about that biology to help us do what we want us to do, all right? So, you know, the topic of your spring seminar series, the future of horticulture. Wow. Well, fortunately for me, Nursery Management Magazine already kind of covered this. So what you're about to hear is just pages taken from that. I'm kidding. The future, all right? It's fun to think about. It also can be a bit intimidating and scary to think about. So that's why I also share this. As any good scientist would say, I know very little, but my questions are large. And that's what I'm going to present to you today is not a lot of answers, but a lot of ideas, okay? A lot of ideas in that context. So horizon surfing, something I love to do. I think as any business, you have to take care of today. You have to look for tomorrow. As any coach on the ball field or the basketball court, you coach your current team and you're recruiting your next team. And that's looking forward, all right? Before I tell you about any further, let me just tell you how I got into soilless substrates. How did I find that path, okay? So it all because of this gentleman. This is my grandfather. His name's Marvin. Marvin Jackson. That's he with his prize bull, and that's me at about 6 or 7 years old, all three generations of Jacksons. They're farmers, okay? So I grew up on a tobacco farm in southeastern North Carolina, and in the April of 1996, at 16 years old, I stepped into the first greenhouse built by the largest, most progressive tobacco farmer in our county, who had built a greenhouse to grow his tobacco transplants in soilless culture. Before then, everyone else grew their tobacco in the ground, and we pulled out bare root and transplanted. And folks, I stepped in that greenhouse and I saw thousands of floating styrofoam trays with thousands of tobacco plants, and it was like stepping onto the surface of Mars. That's how blown away I was with technology I had never seen, and that's how captivated I was about how easy this is going to be compared to how we had to do it back home. All right? That was my first introduction and fascination with soilless culture from that point. And it was all because of the family and the history that I had growing up. Now, thinking also about looking past, those in the room who are graduate students, writing your lit review is not often the thing we love to do the most, but it can be the most beneficial. Because I am convinced in plant production systems, all right, most all of the challenges and problems we face, there are already answers if we look hard enough, or we diversify where we look for information in allied industries. There are informations there, okay? A lot of information to these questions. And I love books. I've created a library, and I kind of like my bomb shelter in my office. No one has books, but I do enjoy books. And then here, talk about information. Trade popular press magazines are the most important way that I can share information with the world is through those, not through scientific papers. Okay, ideally anyone does both, but right here is a lot of evidence before us. One other thing about the history, kind of putting together some of this, anybody recognize these? Ah, yes. So one of my colleagues who retired left behind what I'm guesstimating about 10,000 of these slides. And over the Christmas break this past year, I spent about 3 days in a dark room going through all of these slides. And when you see horticulture from the 1960s, 70s, and actually up until about the mid-90s, and for me, I'm looking at like bark piles and peat bogs and all kind of cool production systems that I've never seen before, all right? To have that perspective of historical, knowing where we've been, okay? And I want to go back to my grandfather for a second. He'd say, boy, how do you know where you're going unless you know where you've been? And that was in regards to being respectful of your elders and knowing what your family history is. And he always called me boy. I'm not sure he ever knew my name was Brian, but it was always boy. Boy, how do you know where you're going unless you know where you've been? And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so keen on the history side of things. All right. So a little bit of background in substrate science and soilless culture. There we go. From some of those slides, I found some very fascinating images to kind of display and portray where we've been. And this is just for the nursery industry, thinking more of the ornamental trees, shrubs. When you look at what our containers used to be, and literally using pure sawdust or soil out of the field to fill containers. And I see some of you shaking your head from that. But think of where we are versus here, all right? Now, this was in the 1960s, early 1970s. Well, that's been a long time, Brian. Of course we've advanced. Think about how much advancement there's been in the last 7 to 10 years. It's at warp speed, kind of like AI and technology, which we'll talk about a bit later, all right? One thing I want to do to set the stage a little bit is talk about growing media demand, and this is for all types of controlled environment and soilless culture horticulture. Now, before I show you this, and some of you may have already seen this chart I'm going to show you, let's define for a quick second controlled environment agriculture. That includes hoop houses. It includes high tunnels. It includes greenhouses, all right? Yes, it includes vertical farms as well. It includes everything where there's some level of control. And I make that statement, not that you don't know that, but sometimes CEA is thought just to be vertical farm, high technology chambers, and that's not true. It's a form of it. So thinking of all of controlled environment agriculture, what does it actually mean volume-wise? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about peat today and why peat moss has really got the spotlight on it from an environmental perspective. But one of the other things I want to mention in this graph, in the substrate soils world for 60, 70 years, what we've never had is any projection of how much we use or how much we plan to use nationally or globally. Because in the United States, companies are not required to report how much product they make or sell. In Europe, they do. So in Europe, they know exactly the volumes and sales prices of what they make per year. All right. So finally, some work out of Wageningen University by a colleague, Chris Block. He finally put together, after many years, an estimate, a survey of how much growing media is used globally. And his summation was 67 million cubic meters in 2017. Okay. And his projection, looking into his crystal ball, he said, hey, that's going to be about 283 million cubic meters. All right. Hundreds of percent increase. All right. In just 30 years. Folks, even if these values are off by 20, 30%, they're still showing a trajectory up. Well, let's talk about why that is, all right? Well, one of the things that's driving it, we've got our bread and butter plants. I'm going to show you that in a few minutes, floriculture and nursery, all right? But we're seeing a transition now into traditionally field-grown crops moving into soilless systems for a variety of reasons, all right? Labor, and labor, of course, is important for everyone. Land water use efficiency, certainly on the West Coast. Earlier ripening in a lot of controlled environment, soilless culture systems. Proximity to consumers. These highly perishable goods that a lot of fruit and vegetables are, if you can produce them closer to their end point of distribution, then saving those 2 days in a truck is 2 more days on the shelf. And there's a lot of economics that are beginning to make sense there, I think. Soil fumigants with methyl bromide, of course, and all the issues with soil pathogens, freeze protection, all in basically resulting in not soilless per se, but fieldless as it drives some of these new fruit markets and new crop markets. Now, I'll never forget my upbringing as far as a scientist is in the floriculture nursery world, and the use of substrates. These are our bread and butter. We've been using these heavily since the 1960s with floriculture, with nursery crops. I did a lot of my PhD work kind of working in both of those realms. Another one of the bread and butter crops used in soilless is mushrooms. We don't talk about mushrooms much in a horticultural stance, except maybe at Penn State they do, but mushrooms rely pretty solely on peat moss and other soilless materials, okay? Now, the not so new, leafy greens. And I say not so new because lettuces and leafy greens have been produced in controlled systems for many, many years. There's been a huge influx of that the last 5 to 7 years, but leafy greens aren't new, nor are tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and eggplants, all right? By the way, this must be Texas grown. Is that what that is? My goodness, you guys do that big here. Cucumbers and eggplants. Those 4 vegetables have been grown in controlled environment greenhouses for decades. More in Europe than in North America, but North America has increased in that dramatically. And it's probably only going to increase, all right? Now, what are some of the new trendsetters that are coming into soilless systems and using substrates and driving that demand of substrates? All right, well, number one would be soft fruit. And strawberries kind of lead that market. And Driscoll's is much to blame for this, but a lot of other fruit genetics companies. And what they've done with strawberries is really quite remarkable in a lot of these vertical farm and other greenhouse environmentally controlled systems. There's a high market demand for these, all right? Also, it must be Texas grown there too. They've got some powerful genetics at Driscoll's. Not just fruit production in greenhouses, but mother plant propagation production. This is something that impacts a lot of other fruit and vegetable industries that aren't using controlled environment systems for fruit, but instead just in the propagation. And even with strawberries, using greenhouses and high tunnels for mother plant production, of course, to make their stolons for their asexual propagation is increasing. There's a large SCRI USDA grant that I'm a part of that's just looking at the propagation phase of that. Blueberries, if you've spent any time or have connections in parts of China, in Peru, in Mexico, there is massive conversion of field-grown blueberries to soilless systems. A lot of that has to do with water resources, a lot of it's labor, a lot of it's other parameters that I mentioned earlier. This is one of the fruit crops that I foresee in all of the crystal or the tea leaves that I'm reading as one that's going to come more into the southern United States as more container production of soft fruit led the way by blueberries, all right? Gerardo Nunez at University of Florida is, in my opinion, the leading expert on blueberry cultivation in soilless systems, and he's doing a lot to kind of advance Florida's system in that. There's also raspberries and blackberries, all right? Now, why do I mention those two specific? Driscoll's. You've heard of Driscoll's, all right? Most people have, even people like me, not in the fruit world as a scientist. Driscoll's, we'll talk about a couple of times in the next half an hour or so. They and their head agronomists have made statements and publicly that the future of berries, the future of soft fruit is soilless culture. And you get a company like Driscoll's that makes that statement, that's powerful. And that has a wake of movement behind it when such entities, broadly speaking globally, are that vested in soilless culture. So we're excited for that support, all right? You'll also today, if you haven't already noticed, I love keeping abreast as best I can through Horta Daily, Flora Daily, Vertical Farm Daily, all the news briefings and coming out of the fruit, produce, and ornamental world. So you'll see a lot of news clips today. Why? It's relevant. It's now. And I wanted to make this as now as possible. But looking at blackberries extending, from the Dutch all the way down through South Africa reports for that. I'm working with a graduate student in North Carolina growing raspberries. And raspberries in Wilmington, which is on the coast, is hot. Raspberries don't like heat. So this particular farm have been growing them for 2 years as annuals in high tunnel greenhouses. Plant them in January, they start fruiting, the fruit production is over, and they toss the plants out by late June. Done. All right, treating them as annuals. But the price point is such that it's worth it for that. So they've been using coconut coir. A lot of you are familiar with coconut. The fruit industry relies on it heavily. All right, so we were looking at, hey, can we not use coconut, but instead use pine bark, which we have mountains of, lots and lots of pine bark. Well, for 2 years, you were like, hey, in this project, no significant difference in growing raspberries in pine bark versus coconut coir. Oh, well, except for this. Coconut at the prices the past 2 years, 90 cents per pot is what it costs for the substrate. Bark, 12 cents per pot. Ooh, okay. People start to raise their eyebrows a little bit. Economy makes a little sense there, all right? Pun intended, makes some sense. Aged. Yep, aged. Aged and compost, similar but two different things as far as that, but it is aged, yes. Cannabis, I had to throw cannabis in there. I'll talk about cannabis a bit later, but since its boom in 2018, 2017, 18, that's certainly been an influx of new crop production, soilless substrate requiring. Christmas trees. Christmas trees, we grow a lot of Christmas trees. And there are millions of forestry seedlings, all soilless. Why? They're getting out of the ground and they're escaping phytophthora. All right. And the Christmas tree industry in North Carolina alone is like a $100 million business. And they're trying to find ways to improve soil health, all right, growing the plants out of the ground. And then they discovered, hey, growing them in soilless containers shaves 2 years off the lifespan of a typical 6 to 8 foot Christmas tree. So there's some other benefits there as well. And by the way, have you ever seen a baby little Fraser fir Christmas tree? A baby? Have you seen a baby? Look at that. Isn't that so cool? All right. Absolutely cool. All right. A few other things, just kind of really quickly. Bananas. What? You can't grow bananas in greenhouses on any scale that's profitable. Well, you certainly can from a propagation side, but you also can from a larger side. Cherries. Well, this is crazy, Brian. Now you're just making stuff up. No, I'm not. Am I saying that cherries are going to be produced fully in greenhouses? No. But certain niche markets and certain geographical locations, it makes sense to actually do so. All right. And that's part of the other thing I would share with you that I've seen in the last just 10 years. People don't say no anymore as quickly to new, bold ideas. They say, is it scalable? Is it economical? And they're at least asking, can we do it? Not just no immediately about growing something unusual, even in greenhouses. Melons, a lot of melon production, potato production. We had a conversation about this today. Now, are all potatoes from McDonald's, French fries going to be grown in hydroponic, aeroponic? Well, likely not, all right? But certain parts of the world where some of these niche kind of systems, it kind of makes sense. Dragon fruit, kiwi fruit, a lot is turning to soilless. 10 years ago, half of these never would have existed, at least on the public scene for doing that. A little bit about the CEA market, all right? The controlled environment market, and depending on, I suppose, which resource you get the metrics from, you can get different forecasts as to what the expenditures or the gross is likely to be. But here we are in 2014, and the projection, even if it's half that, it's a massive amount of money. A lot of investment into controlled environment agriculture, depending on how you define that, all right? So, mostly, controlled environment agriculture in the last 5 years has been what crop being grown and promoted to grow in vertical farms? What's the biggest crop? Lettuce, right there. Come on, right there it is. Now, in full support, 100%, let's get that clear. But there's a part of me, not as just a scientist, but as a human and as a citizen who says, hey, how many billions of dollars have been generated from private capital on the idea of growing food outside of urban areas to feed those people? And then they grow lettuce at a premium that's sold in clamshells at the Wegmans and the Publix and the high-end grocery stores. Okay? That's Brian speaking my opinion about that's not a way of feeding the future. However, I am in full support of all the advancements in controlled environment agriculture, even for systems like that, because I'm questioning, can this be a gateway into figuring out how to lower energy cost, figure out how to get a profit on these big systems so that then other crops and other foods can begin to get grown and can begin to get sold of nutritional value, all right? So I've got a lot of optimism and by no means negative toward the lettuce, all right? So sometimes I find it good to look back to see forward. Now, some of the vertical farming systems, companies have went bust in the last year and a half, okay? Talked a lot about this at the Indoor AgCon conference in Las Vegas 2 weeks ago, and the keynote speaker, Paul Salou, who's the president and CEO of Little Leaf Farms up in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. And he basically made the point of, hey, my advice is start small and grow incrementally and get your loans from banks, all right? That was his advice to the audience for that, because there's a lot of questions and concerns about vertical farming systems failing, all right? So here's my point in saying that, all right? There's been another industry that boomed 2017, 18, 19, 20, and then began to collapse and deflate. Which industry is that? Hemp, all right? So you look back at hemp and you may often see from bloom to bust, okay? Now, am I saying this is happening to vertical farms? No, but I'm saying if we aren't careful, we learn from mistakes and take advice to move forward in that direction, all right? This is the quote I thought of Charlie Paul when I put this on here, and it's from an economic perception, I guess, from a recession, but the same thing, and the article was about vertical farming systems failing, and why are they failing, all right? When the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked, all right? When times get tough, you find out who's structurally sound enough to survive those tough time periods, and if they're settled to go into the future. All right, challenges facing the growing media industry. I'll just list a few of these. First, geopolitical storms. Okay, we've got storms of the climatic side, climatic approach. But we've also got geopolitical decisions being made. Look what happened in Sri Lanka in the last 2 years with their government. All right, with some governmental political decisions made that basically caused a coup, and the government in the country shut down, and that impacted horticulture. Why? Not to mention the lives of the people who live in Sri Lanka, but all the coconut coming out of Sri Lanka, which feeds the horticultural world, is growing media. What about Chile? Well, they had a new governmental election a year and a half ago. All right, more Green Party. They came in on the stance of very climate active. So they passed all the way up to one vote shy in the Senate chamber a bill that would have banned peat extraction in Chile. Okay, well, that's good for the environment. Oh, and by the way, they were going to ban peat importation into the country. Oh, okay, well, maybe we've got 20 years to adjust to new things. Immediately, it would have been a collapse of that entire economy if they were to pull peat immediately out of the agricultural world. It's just a couple of examples of these geopolitical decisions that can affect us in horticulture. Volatile global weather patterns, all right? That's what limits the amount of peat moss coming out of Canada, not the fact that peat is limited, all right? I'll show you that in a few minutes. Spread of misinformation and cherry-picked information to fit someone or some company's narrative or agenda. And we all have to do that, and I'm guilty myself of certain things, of cherry-picking what I want to hear or see to justify a decision that I've made or that I want to make, so it happens. The war in the Ukraine and closing of Belarus, all right? What does that mean? I've got a slide coming up a bit more on that. Continued labor shortages, fuel prices, issues and threats of peat alternatives. Everyone thinks peat's the devil and everything else is the savior. That's not true, all right? It's not true. When we look at everything that's not peat, as closely as we're looking at peat, we're going to find cracks within that structure as well, okay? So that's what we're trying to work through now. And the biggest one, decisions of the big box stores, all right? We in the US are not in any threat of having any regulatory pressure on peat reduction or usage in growing media, none. But it doesn't matter if one of these or any other box store decides that, hey, we want to be proactive and only sell plants that are grown in 50% peat-reduced substrates. Boom, what does that do? Everyone who's going to sell to those box stores has to adjust immediately to selling that product. IKEA's already started that with some of their initiatives. They sell a lot of house plants in their IKEA stores, now perlite free. Okay, and Lowe's at the highest level of the head office in Charlotte, North Carolina, have had the decisions and fortunately have brought in people to talk them off the ledge from making such decisions for that. The war in the Ukraine, the unfortunate war in the Ukraine, has led to a lot of things. Fertilizer, we've heard a lot about, all right, with the Russian pulling back the fertilizer. Energy, the oil and the fuel not coming into Russia led to a lot of energy crisis in Europe in the past 18 months, which led to a lot of decrease in some horticultural commodity production because of that heat, because of the lack of heat. Another thing, peat has been harvested and burned for fuel for centuries and kept hundreds of millions of people alive. All right, but as of 3 years ago, basically all peat harvesting for fuel had ended until 2022 when it kicked back in again because of the energy crisis. And now more peat's being harvested to burn for fuel, which drives the whole CO2 thing again from a peat perspective, all because of that war. All right, and there's lots of other news about both in Israel currently, all right, and in the Ukraine and how that's affecting horticulture. One other kind of odd thing, but it's really strange. I just got this from a colleague about a month ago. This is actually an unspent shell of some type, I do not know, in the side of a pine tree in the Ukraine, all right? Now, I love pine trees, as you're going to find out in a few minutes, all right, which is why this is significant, but war has its impacts. The changing climate of the environment. Well, peat, and I'm not going to read all this to you, I've kind of already mentioned this, but peat has been the backbone of horticultural production for 70 years. And it will remain the backbone and the Rolls Royce of substrates for long into the future, all right? But due to an awareness now of the environmental parameters around destruction of or altering of those natural peat bogs, there's now great initiatives to reduce its use, okay? In Europe, they have no choice. They've been harvesting peat for centuries, and they have raped and pillaged a lot of those bogs that they can't replace, okay? But they are mandated now. The EU, there's no coming back. It's not a decision anymore. So the Europeans are now reactive. They are, any European company making substrates or growing plants in substrates have to transition reducing peat immediately, all right? In North America, it's more proactive. Now, the problem is this, with our climatic weather events in Canada dumping a lot of rain during the summer. Remember the fires in Canada? Remember that on the news? That inhibited peat extraction in Canada as well. Canada in 2023 had 45% lower peat harvest than they anticipated. That's a huge supply gap, okay? So a lot of these things are fueling things we see like this, the peat-free pledge, all right, which I will never completely stand behind, but I'll also stand behind anyone who chooses to make that decision for their business. And you look through the news, all right, all about peats, from the New York Times through basically every publication that I see or pay attention to. Peat has been in the news almost relentlessly in the last couple of years. Environmental scope of this is important, and I'm not denouncing that at all. It is very, very important. And just about 3 weeks ago, the Peatlands and Climate Change second edition book came out that tries to address how they're handling this, how they're doing this in the best sustainable way possible. I told you I share a little bit about peat, and it's not too much of a substrate talk, but I did want to just make sure to relay a couple of things, all right? Why is the peat bog issue so sensitive? Well, peat bogs cover 3% of the Earth's surface, but 30% of the carbon, more than forests. Okay, and when you tap into those resources, that carbon has to go somewhere, so it's releasing it back into the atmosphere. Now, is horticulture to blame for all of the carbon release of peat? No. Okay, and I've got the statistics up there from the International Peatland Society you can see, but globally, in the last 100 years, total amount of time we've been record keeping, globally, 0.05% of peat has been harvested for horticulture. In Canada, where we get 90% of our peat from, 0.03% in 70 years has been extracted, opened up and extracted bogs for horticulture. All right? How much does that compare to forestry? Many times more. How much for agriculture? Many times more. There are more roads and highways built through Canada destroying peat bogs than horticulture does in any given year. Okay? Now, are we still releasing carbon by opening bogs? Absolutely. But what do we do with that peat? Oh, let's take a look. Is it worth it? How do we weigh that? Let's take a look. Sustainability and crop production. That's where I'm kind of getting at with this whole point, using peat as a model. A few things in sustainability regards, all right? Specifically as it relates to substrates. Carbon footprint, carbon release, sequestration. What are the processing requirements for any growing media, from rock wool to peat to bark? What are the inputs needed to create the product, and what does it take to get it to the end user, the customer, the grower, okay? They're assessing all of this stuff. Freight, transportation. I mentioned before that peat is not the devil and other things aren't necessarily the savior of that, because everything we do has a footprint, everything. It's about quantifying that, because you can't change something unless you know what the numbers are, unless you quantify it. And then let's reduce it a little bit. And there are a lot of different things, from OMRI-listed Organic Material Review Institute list products that are not certified organic, but are classified organic from that. All right, some other sustainability efforts. People, planet, and profit. You got to have all three of those for any sustainability initiative to actually work. And I'm very proud to serve with a colleague of mine and a graduate of this department, Dr. Melinda Knuth, on a big initiative from the American Floral Endowment, leading a Sustainabloom, or a floriculture sustainability initiative. So we're trying to step out of our boxes a little bit to lead some of these initiatives. Trade agreements, thinking of sustainability, not just planet, not just profit, but people. All right? That you can't maybe read this very much, but I thought it was important to put on, so I'm going to read it to you. But this is what a lot of soil companies have to agree to before they sell their products to box stores. All right? Right here. The supplier, let's see. The supplier represents and warrants, to the best of its knowledge and belief, that neither the supplier nor any of its directors, officers, employees, agents, representatives, contractors, or subcontractors engage in modern slavery in the process. They have to attest to that. All right. Now that really matters when materials coming from other parts of the world that don't have the same system that we have in place. All right. So coming into the human side of things. All right. Life cycle analysis, carbon assessment. All right. If you can measure it, you can monitor it. All right. Without measurements, we can't monitor. And as scientists, we know that. Current life cycle assessments are being developed to better be able to ascertain what the true impact in LCA is of the materials we use in horticulture. All right. This one was just one on growing media released out of Denmark in 2001. Just about 2 weeks ago, Oasis, if you're familiar with Oasis, they just reported some of their independent findings using their Oasis cubes, loose-filled plugs, pressed peat plugs, and they even stated what some of the total carbon was. And here it is, the Aeromax at 6.4, pressed peat at 278. So I applaud Oasis for being proactive to release some of this carbon data that they're getting on their products. And you're going to see more of this as we have those metrics in place. A couple of other things. Now, this is a photo I took of a presentation I watched just about a couple of weeks ago. All right, it's from Premier Tech, and it was offered through Grower Talks, all right, Ball Publishing Grower Talks webinar series. And this was on what does the impact of peat really like, comparatively speaking, based on life cycle analysis and carbon analysis. All right, peatland industry in Canada, 1.5 megatons of CO2 annually released. What does that mean? That's 0.2% of all of the Canadian greenhouse gases. All right, it's comparable to one cement factory, all right, or the equivalent amount of CO2 from the dog and cat food consumption in the United States. All right, well, it's still CO2, absolutely. What do we do with that peat, though? This came from James Altland, who just presented about a month and a half, it's actually maybe a couple of months ago. And this was also a webinar about peat usage. And what did James Altland from USDA state about peat? On 1 acre of peat, remember, we got 1.5 million megatons of carbon released in Canada. But what do we do with that peat? 27 million tomato seedlings can be grown, which is 270,000 tons of fruit. 3.3 million forest seedlings, 6,400 acres of reforestation, and 56 million annuals produced on one annual. What is all of that peat doing? It's growing plants. To do what? To fix carbon. To do what? Give us food on our tables. All right? So I wanted to present that to you, not that harvesting peat doesn't have any impact, but look what we're doing. Weigh those options before we talk about something being sustainable. And then lastly, I just want to show a little bit about some of the frameworks that a lot of soil companies are undertaking to evaluate any raw material they're using or plan to use to replace peat. And it's pretty exhaustive from the business performance side of reliability, price, risk management, product properties, to the social side and the environmental side. So that microscope is getting bigger as we look at product development into the future. Changing climate of technology. Oh, wow, this could be a lot. How many AI or AI-generated or robotic systems have we just seen if you just, maybe you were involved with some yourself? University of Florida in horticulture there's made, well, actually the whole university is a huge push into AI development of faculty. All right, we have a new dean at NC State and AI is kind of one of his banners that he's carrying, and we're kind of moving in that direction of hiring faculty for AI. All right, so what does that mean for horticulture? My goodness, we're zapping weeds with lasers, or we will be in the future. We're picking strawberries and even raspberries mechanically. Now that is brilliant technology for the sensitivity of those highly perishable soft fruit. All kind of, now, are these mainstream? No, not yet, but nor were electric cars 20 years ago, okay? So think about the future as we plan forward for that. Chat GPT. Dr. Reed, do you ever have any problems with Chat GPT with any of your students? No. Neither do I, because teaching Plant ID, they can't Chat GPT an answer, okay? But it's real challenging, but it's affecting all of us, all right? Let me show you some examples. I tried it. I'm a substrate scientist who studies processing wood, using wood fiber to create growing media, all right? I entered some words. Let's see what I found. WISE. Wood inclusive substrate engineering. I could never have come up with that. Woods, wood originated organically designed substrate. Wow, that's good. Forest, functional organic resource substrate technology. This is some brilliant stuff if you use it appropriately. And one more, media, maximizing efficiency during indoor agriculture. I'm gonna trademark that one. That's the power of good technology when used appropriately for that, all right? One quick thing about technology just within substrates. We're not just putting stuff in pots and seeing if plants grow, all right? We're characterizing and engineering materials and fingerprinting them so that physically, chemically, biologically, hydrologically, we already know before a plant goes in it if that plant's going to succeed or not. That's the level. And we have new technologies that help us advance how we're doing those things, all right? This is computer-aided tomography, CAT scan, basically. And we've been doing a lot of scanning and looking at inside substrates to see how water moves, but also see how roots grow and how root initiation forms even on cuttings. Let me show you a couple of things what this X-ray can do. All right, unlike a body that goes into a CAT scan, it rolls over us. This one is fixed, and then the plant sample turns in front of it, all right, generating an actual image. All right, this is a geranium cutting. I'll talk about getting students excited with technology and soilless production, or any production for that matter. Things like this are visual, they're stimulating. They let us see on the inside from that. And we just place filters on these images, and like our bones, all right, it removes the flesh and it shows only the hard structures. We can also do that for wood fiber versus peat. All right, let's look at the difference of these two. Ooh, imagine that. Look at that root zone environment. Can you imagine you're a root moving through there? Oh, all those spaces for water and air passages. Oh, that's super cool. All right. And then substrates of the future. All right. Mars, the moon. What does that mean? Let's take a look. Wood fiber. I've spent 20 years working with engineered wood products trying to advance their usage. We're getting there. We've got a long way to go. All right. But a lot of wood products. Why wood products? Of all substrates globally, the most researched and reported material of any other, okay? Why? Proximity, malleability, and economy are the three main things driving it as the number one possibility as a peat reducing agent. All right. And if you get back to that table I showed you earlier on, wood fiber is expected to increase 1,000% more than any other raw material. All right. So we got a lot of work to do in the wood world to understand that better. Biochar. All right. Been around for long time. A lot of investigations into soilless media the last 10 years. But we had a conversation this morning. Almost snake oil. Its benefit in soil proven, undoubtable. Okay, in soilless, but now we're backing up. I say we. Others are backing up and reevaluating how biochar can be used in agriculture, certainly, but even in soilless culture for that. There's a lot of companies now offering biochar products to be used as pure 100% rock wool alternatives in cannabis and greenhouse production facilities. Some other organic feedstocks that we have worked with or are working with to identify organic fibers to make substrates. Miscanthus, cotton. I think you grow a little cotton around here, don't you? Yeah. Dairy fiber, palm oil. I've got a project in Egypt looking at palm oil and date palm waste and residuals. Water hyacinth. I got a project working with some folks in Brazil where water hyacinth is an obnoxious freshwater weed and it's clogging their waterways. Or how are they removing that? So I'm trying to help them with that. Seaweed. You've seen the news reports of the seaweed, massive, like country-sized floating vessels or islands coming through the oceans. You know, what do we do with that stuff? All kind of different materials, including a lot of hemp biomass. All right, left on the agricultural fields, which is also a good thing for the field, but there's a lot of biomass available, including some I even saw from wherever that institution is. I'm not quite sure, but I had to throw that in there, a little plug. All right, this is a good thing, folks, because just as of a few weeks ago, this really big governmental report called the 23 billion ton report hasn't been published in about 6-7 years. And it stated the following: the United States could sustainably triple biomass production to more than 1 billion tons annually. And that's from the Department of Energy. Wow. That hits right at the heart of what we're trying to do to truly, finally commercialize and understand how to use organic biomass as a growing media, not just as a peat replacement, but maybe holistically. Other things in kind of the innovative world, young plants, a lot in biogels. All right, biogel materials, a lot of young propagation substrates being created. Why? The vertical farming CEA boom used these young plugs and young growth transplant medias. So a lot of companies are investing a lot of innovations into that. One in particular I'm working with a group out of Stony Brook in Long Island, New York, is this Nurture project. And these are all chemists. And through this nitric oxidation process, they take organic biomass, run it through a reactor, and they generate fertilizers, growing media, and biogels. All right? That's what's fun as a scientist, is to jump on a collaborative approach with some really new and cool technologies that may not be scalable yet or economical yet. But again, neither was the car the first time it was developed. All right? So it's all about hopefully timing and moving that happen. Climate of demographics. Now, the public is, I say smarter, I will say informed. Because if you can't read this gentleman is saying, honey, come look. I found some information all the world's top scientists and doctors missed. Now, as a teacher, I get that all the time. Well, look, I'm right. They'll hold their phones up at me. Look, I was right. Okay? What does this mean? Okay? This is Instagram. This is TikTok. This is TikTok. This is TikTok, primarily. Okay? I don't own the app. I respect it for what it is. I'm not saying it's bad. But the information that our stakeholders and our students, our stakeholders, are getting is very different now than in the past. Okay, so what does that translate to? Even with growing media and peat, there have been articles written in the New York Times, and these are just that I was fortunate enough to contribute to. New York Times, the BBC, National Geographic, Popular Science Magazine, and a whole host of other podcasts of gardeners and growers globally interested in peat reduction and what does that mean for the environment. All right? That didn't happen 10 years ago. People didn't have access or care or concern. So that's actually mattering. And then the opportunity of a lifetime, and this is the coolest thing. I was invited to Washington, D.C. to talk to testify before the House Agricultural Committee. All right, and this was in September 2022, the last day of the session, and it was all about peat. What is peat? And the congressman said, why can't we just grow our own? Literally, all right? I appreciate the question. I didn't expect them to know anything about peat. It's coming from Canada and they can't get it to us. Well, why don't we just grow it ourselves? And we explained through that process, all right? But I never would have dreamed to be in Congress testifying on peat moss, but they cared. They asked questions. And folks, we'll see what happens from that. But these are some things just that's different publicly about the attention that crop production, that horticulture is having for that. All right? Concern over food system sourcing and security. I hear it from my students all the time. I see the blogs, I see the social media about what people are thinking about where their food comes from. All right? Locality of that, the impact of that, a lot of things of that. Check the time. All right, I'm wrapped up here in just a second. Concern over food, come on. No, change. Change is not always easy. All right, and I saw this cartoon sometime back and I had to take advantage of it because you ask a group of people, who wants change? And oh yeah, all right, who wants to change? And it's a very different story. It's a very, very different story for that. Changing climate of academia. All right, now this is completely off topic for Soilless culture per se, but as a scientist and as a member of the academy, I feel it's important to kind of share some of the things I'm seeing. All right, listen to the mournful call of the untenured academic. And it's tough. More of my graduate students who came into my program as a PhD wanting to go into academics have changed their mind in the last 3 years than ever before. The number of PhD students coming into NC State's program wanting to do academics has changed their mind. Now, is that new? No, people always do that. That's development. That's professional growth as you learn what you want to do and what don't want to do. But the struggles that we have, all right, fed up and burn out. I inquire and suggest you read this from Nature. All right, anybody seen this article? All right, it talks about the issues during the pandemic, and it's worth a read. Not that you're considering bailing out, okay, but it's worth a read. What about the attack on the tenure process that Texas and Florida, and even to some levels North Carolina has proposed from a political agenda standpoint? All right, academia is changing as well, and we got to at least acknowledge that. Grand challenges. I'm going to run really quickly, just we move through this. The top global risk in 2024. Extreme weather, number one. AI-generated misinformation, number two. All right, that says something about where society is relative to what they're thinking. The UN sustainability goals and initiatives can't address the AI, but it can address the climate and it can address food. And what do we do for that? Folks, with all the technologies we have and the great systems of containers and greenhouses and growing spaces, there are still billions of people in the world who still grow in basically the most modest of systems. This is still soilless culture. How do we help them improve more and more? And fortunately, horticulture is full of innovations. That's what we're here for, all right? Look at this. Botswana, China, Cuba, Vietnam, South Africa, Syria, all relying more on soilless production and greenhouse environments to help grow more food and grow more plants. Whether it's salt-tolerant crops, we've got PFAS everywhere, all right? Probably floating around in this room, but it's found its way in compost and soil systems. We've got to do a lot more on energy efficiency for controlled environment agriculture before it fully expands. A huge research area with that. Plasma-activated water, all right, for making fertilizers. I'm working with some nuclear engineers at NC State who specialize in plasma that generates nitrogen in water to fertilize plants. What if that's scalable at every operation? Oh my. Texas A&M grad student achieves world first by growing chickpeas in moon dust mixture. And I didn't just put this in here today. That was planned, I promise you. Food production in arid areas. That's the great thing about soilless. We can grow where it is impossible. And folks, these are things I've heard my words and others' words. A world where food production is not seasonal is possible because hunger is not seasonal, nor should food production be. And I know soilless production has a large part in playing a role in how to solve that because it goes beyond just a company making money. It goes beyond us getting tenure. We're in a position to make a difference. And that's a very, very big difference, in my opinion. Water resources, all right? Strawberries, as one example. Water cannot be free anymore from Driscoll's. All right, this will change. This will change agriculture. This will change everything. Composting is one of those solutions. And in summary, all right, growing media past, present, and future. You've already got your opinions about what I shared. I want to share a few with you. Our industry is on the forefront of innovations and global change. Substrates are security. It's national security. It's food security. When the pandemic hit almost 4 years ago right now, peat moss was one of the absolute first products deemed essential to come out of Canada into the U.S. Why? Not because we grow petunias and pansies, but because it's growing food. All right? That is critical. All right? Global trends, perceptions, realities, we've got a lot of that happening. What we must not do is walk in circles and repeat what we've done for 30 years in substrate science or in or in general plant science. Move forward, learn what we have done, and let industry and academic partnerships guide us forward. That's the only way. It's not the best way, it's the only way forward. And speaking of evolution, even the human Brian is capable of evolving. So we all can evolve to that. And no one cares what you did. This is what my mentor taught me years ago. No one cares what you did. They care what it means to them. And as scientists and as public figures, we know that. So I challenge you, the world is watching and waiting, so let's go. And to this point, I did add this slide, Charlie, today. Above all else, leave a legacy. These are 7 of my graduate students who were all at ASHS last summer. They're all in different places around the world creating their own legacies, but I love it. And lastly, being proactive. Dig ditches during droughts, not during floods. My mentor, when I was in high school, my ag teacher who I worked for when I wasn't on the tobacco fields, I worked for him and he had me digging ditches in the driest part of the summers in preparation. So we know more about the stars in the sky than the substrates in our pots. And on that, I know I ran long. I do not apologize for that because I'm around. And congratulations, Dr. Reed, on your retirement. Fantastic, my friend. Well deserved. Thank you.
So you showed the chart. I'm trying to talk loud enough for Dr. Lineberger too. You showed the chart in 2050 that the demand for
Growing media.
Soilless substrate.
All soilless.
Okay, all soilless. 4 times what we currently have. Do we even have the capability of producing that much soilless substrate by 2050?
There are 2 dilemmas. You've got a 4x increase in growing media demand in 30 years, less than, and you've got peat being reduced this way. That's the crux. Are we ready? No. Will it take decades? Probably, to get there. Can we grow 100% peat free? Absolutely. Can we feed the world 100% peat free today? No. All right. There's where the advancement's got to be, which is why I talked about the other biomasses so much. We've got to figure out how to not just evaluate them. We've done that. All right. How to scale them up, how to precondition them, how to process them differently to make them work, at least long enough to grow lettuce or cucumbers or strawberries. Yeah.
Brian, you mentioned that you didn't have a problem with GPT because you teach a plant ID course. Have you ever thought about the impact that the iPhone has on your plant identification courses?
Oh, Dan, absolutely, I do. And students are very creative and crafty creatures. But I too was a creative and crafty creature early on, so I know what to look for. So I have to ban, cell phones or even watches when it comes to, even plant ID. So technology is changing students' dynamics and abilities to do things they should and even shouldn't. So your point's well taken.
Yeah, I just had a question. You talked about the increase in demand, but what about the prices? Has the price really increased in the past decade or so with the demand increasing? And if it has increased, how big is that increase?
What the percentage of price increase is, I do not know. It has went up. I would say probably 30 to 40% at least, minimally. The other thing is this. There are a lot of big growers, vegetable growers, mushrooms, greenhouses that buy raw peat. They make their own mixes. Canadians don't sell raw peat anymore. All right, why? It's more valuable for them to sell mixes where they blend other things with the peat to dilute it, and they get a higher market price for it. So none of the peat companies in Canada, and there are 14 big ones, 5 really big ones, 14 major ones. None of them consider themselves peat companies anymore. We're mixed companies. They won't sell raw peat. So it was the mushroom industry's inability to get raw peat in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, who reached out to their representative in Congress, who happened to be on the House Ag Committee, which is why we had that meeting in Pennsylvania, in Washington, D.C. It wasn't green industry, it was the mushroom industry, all because they couldn't get peat.
So, I don't know much about peat necessarily, how it's grown like in the bogs, but if we're not depleting it like to an extreme rate, is it possible that it could grow back in Europe?
Brilliant question. First of all, peat accumulates in bogs at 1 millimeter per year accumulation. All right, so you imagine how many thousands of years it takes, okay? In Canada, when they harvest bogs, they may only go down 50% of the available peat. They stop well before they get to the bottom, and they go in with a reclamation plan called a moss layer technique, and they reestablish that bog. And in 15 years, a bog goes from being a source to a sink once again. So that is really, really good science and data. In Europe, they have went so far down and mismanaged that much of it cannot be, but they are doing what they can do. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
In your opinion, when it comes to, vertical farming and aquaponics in general, what is the biggest barrier between all the farms? Like, is it space? Is it getting the word out? Why do you think it doesn't, it's not exploding?
As far as why some have failed or why it's just food for... Well, a lot of the true vertical farming systems that have come on in the last 3 to 5 years were capital-based investments who wanted an immediate return on that investment. And a lot of these companies, these greenhouses, were relying on intellectual property and software technologies as being what they're going to make their money on, not on lettuce production. They weren't trying to be farmers, they were trying to be data generators for intellectual properties. That's the main reason they failed. They didn't start small and want to make sure they can be profitable selling lettuce or selling strawberries. They were trying to go after the bigger data.
Brian, thank you for a great presentation. And you mentioned at the beginning and at the end something which really resonates with us. We are one of the few remaining departments of horticulture. And then you said horticulture is at the forefront of innovation and security support. Why are we losing horticulture departments?
I've watched one of my alma maters fall into that category. And as a well, I don't know if the economic model for a Department of Agriculture to consolidate departments makes better sense. One department head, not two, half the administrative staff. I'm not sure if those are some of the factors. So I wish I had a better answer. And a question I haven't really thought much about as to why they're not dissolving. Well, they are dissolving. And even Virginia Tech, I'm a proud alum of Virginia Tech, and they lost their horticultural status and their plant science, and their number of horticulture enrolls went straight down. They can't market as being horticulture, and people want horticulture degrees for that. So, but NC State, as we mentioned this morning when we chatted, our enrollment fortunately has doubled in the last 4 years. So we went from like 90 to 190 students. So we're like facing major growing pains growing that quickly, but we'll take those pains. We'll take those pains.
So we're about out of time. We're actually going to make a slow walk over to the rec for Dr. Reed's retirement party. So I'm sure Dr. Jackson will love to talk.
Oh my goodness, yeah, I'm here until 5 a.m. in the morning, so we can talk until then.
Congratulate Dr. Jackson.
Thank you so much.